According to multiple political sources in Washington, a sudden political shockwave erupted after former President Donald Trump made a controversial statement that triggered immediate backlash across the U.S. political system. Within just a few hours, reactions escalated rapidly, transforming what initially appeared to be a heated political remark into a full-scale institutional confrontation centered in the nation's capital. Senior lawmakers from Congress moved swiftly, demanding clarification on the limits of presidential rhetoric and questioning the broader implications of such statements when delivered by a figure with significant political influence. At the center of this unfolding crisis stands Donald Trump, a former U.S. president whose words are now being scrutinized not merely as political opinion, but as a potential catalyst for wider instability. Several members of Congress, speaking across party lines, signaled growing concern that the tone and content of the statement may have crossed into dangerous territory, where political language begins to blur with incitement. As pressure mounted, what was once considered an unlikely scenario began to surface in serious discussions inside political circles: the possibility of a forced resignation or an unprecedented escalation of institutional response. Meanwhile, emergency meetings were convened across multiple congressional committees, with lawmakers analyzing not only the content of the statement but also its potential consequences for public safety and political stability. Observers noted that the speed of escalation was unusually intense, reflecting deeper fractures already present within the U.S. political landscape. In parallel, public discourse spiraled into a heated debate, amplifying divisions and drawing in both supporters and critics into a rapidly intensifying confrontation. The situation has since evolved beyond a single statement, raising fundamental questions about the boundaries of power, the responsibility of political figures, and the resilience of democratic institutions under pressure. With Washington now entering a phase of heightened tension, all eyes are fixed on Donald Trump's next move, as well as the countermeasures being prepared within Congress. Is this merely another political controversy, or the beginning of a turning point that could redefine the balance of power in the United States? Welcome to our channel, where we break down the most complex global developments through a structured and in-depth analytical lens. Today's unfolding political crisis in Washington is not an isolated event, but rather a reflection of deeper tensions that have been building within the U.S. political system over an extended period of time. At its core, this situation revolves around the increasingly blurred boundaries between political speech, institutional responsibility, and the potential real-world consequences that can emerge when rhetoric escalates beyond traditional limits. In recent years, the United States has experienced a noticeable rise in political polarization, with divisions not only between parties but also within them, creating a fragile environment where even a single statement can trigger a chain reaction. Donald Trump remains one of the most influential political figures in this landscape, with a communication style that often generates strong reactions, both supportive and critical, across different segments of society. This influence amplifies the impact of every public statement, turning words into powerful signals that can shape narratives, mobilize groups, and shift the political atmosphere within hours. In the current case, the controversy stems from a statement that has been interpreted by critics as carrying elements of extreme punitive intent toward political opponents. Such interpretations have raised alarms among lawmakers, who view this not merely as rhetorical aggression, but as a potential escalation that could destabilize an already tense environment. At the same time, the institutional framework of the United States is built upon a system of checks and balances, where Congress plays a critical role in monitoring and responding to actions that may exceed constitutional norms. This dynamic has now been activated, with congressional leaders moving to reassess the limits of executive influence, even when exercised through public communication rather than formal policy decisions. Meanwhile, the broader geopolitical context adds another layer of complexity to the situation. The United States is currently engaged in multiple international challenges, including ongoing tensions in the Middle East and the prolonged conflict involving Ukraine, both of which demand strategic focus and political stability. Any internal disruption at the leadership level, therefore, carries implications that extend beyond domestic politics, potentially affecting diplomatic positioning, military coordination, and global perception. Observers have pointed out that moments like this often serve as stress tests for democratic systems, revealing both their strengths and their vulnerabilities under pressure. In such a climate, every institutional response, every public statement, and every political calculation becomes part of a larger equation that determines how the system adapts or reacts. As the situation continues to develop, several critical questions remain unanswered. How far is Congress willing to go in redefining the boundaries of acceptable political conduct? Will internal divisions within political parties intensify or stabilize under pressure? And perhaps most importantly, can the current system absorb this level of tension without triggering a deeper institutional crisis? The sequence of events began with a public statement made by Donald Trump that quickly spread across media platforms and political circles in Washington. According to congressional observers, the wording of the statement carried a tone that was interpreted as directly targeting political opponents with punitive implications, marking a notable escalation compared to previous rhetoric. Within hours of its release, lawmakers from multiple committees reacted, describing the language as unusually confrontational and potentially dangerous in the current political climate. Several members of Congress expressed concern that such statements, when delivered by a figure of Trump's influence, could move beyond political discourse and enter a space where they might encourage real-world consequences. One senior lawmaker stated during an internal discussion, "This is no longer just about words. This is about the potential impact those words can have on public behavior." As reactions intensified, congressional leadership initiated a series of emergency consultations, bringing together representatives from different political factions to assess the situation. These meetings focused on two primary questions: whether the statement had crossed constitutional boundaries, and what institutional response would be appropriate if such a line had indeed been breached. Meanwhile, legal analysts were called in to evaluate the broader implications, particularly in relation to the separation of powers and the responsibilities attached to influential political figures. At the same time, federal agencies began closely monitoring public reactions, especially on digital platforms where discussions rapidly evolved into more polarized and emotionally charged exchanges. Reports indicated that certain groups had started interpreting the statement in more extreme ways, raising concerns among security officials about the risk of escalation. In response, security measures were discreetly increased around key government buildings, including areas surrounding the Capitol and the White House, as a precautionary step. Simultaneously, public discourse intensified across national media, with major outlets providing continuous coverage and analysis of the unfolding situation. Commentators debated whether the statement represented a strategic political move or a miscalculation that could carry unintended consequences. Within Congress, the tone of discussion became increasingly urgent, with lawmakers dissecting the statement line by line in an effort to determine its intent and potential legal implications. Several committees began preparing for possible hearings, aiming to formally examine the effects of such rhetoric on national stability and institutional integrity. In parallel, internal dynamics within the Republican Party started to shift subtly. Some members maintained a cautious distance, avoiding direct public defense of Trump's remarks, while others voiced concern about the long-term political cost of escalating rhetoric. This emerging divergence signaled the first visible signs of internal strain, as party members weighed their positions carefully in a rapidly evolving environment. At the same time, Trump's core supporters remained vocal, framing the statement as an exercise of free speech and political strength, thereby adding another layer of complexity to the overall response. This dual reaction created a situation in which both support and criticism intensified simultaneously, amplifying the overall tension within the system. As the situation developed, the White House became the focal point of mounting pressure, with every subsequent move by Trump being closely watched and analyzed. Advisors within his team reportedly began reviewing the statement and preparing potential responses, anticipating the possibility of further institutional action. Legal teams also entered a heightened state of readiness, considering scenarios that could involve formal inquiries or hearings. Meanwhile, congressional leaders continued to push forward with oversight measures, signaling that the issue had moved beyond political disagreement into the realm of institutional accountability. The speed at which these developments unfolded created a sense of urgency rarely seen in recent political episodes. Observers noted that the situation resembled a rapidly tightening cycle, where each reaction triggered another layer of response, leaving little room for de-escalation. At this stage, The crisis had clearly expanded beyond a single statement, evolving into a broader confrontation between political authority, institutional limits, and public perception. The central question now was no longer what had been said, but what would happen next as the system responded under increasing pressure. To understand why the current situation has escalated so rapidly, it is essential to examine the broader historical and structural context of political communication and institutional balance in the United States. The American political system has long operated on a delicate equilibrium between freedom of speech and the responsibility that comes with holding public office, particularly at the highest levels of leadership. Presidents and influential political figures have always possessed the ability to shape public discourse, but that influence has traditionally been constrained by norms, expectations, and an awareness of potential consequences. Over time, however, these informal boundaries have begun to shift. The rise of digital media and real-time communication platforms has transformed how political messages are delivered, amplified, and interpreted by the public. Statements that might once have remained within limited audiences now spread instantly across the entire nation and beyond, often without context or moderation. This transformation has significantly increased the power of political rhetoric, turning individual statements into catalysts capable of triggering large-scale reactions. At the same time, the United States has entered a period marked by heightened political polarization. Divisions between parties have deepened, but more importantly, fractures within parties themselves have become increasingly visible. This internal fragmentation creates an environment where political actors must constantly navigate between maintaining support from their base and avoiding alienation of broader constituencies. Donald Trump's political trajectory has been closely intertwined with these shifts. His communication style, characterized by direct, often confrontational language, has resonated strongly with segments of the population while simultaneously generating concern among institutional actors. This dual dynamic has played a central role in shaping the current landscape, where each statement carries both mobilizing potential and destabilizing risk. Historically, moments of tension between the executive branch and Congress have occurred during periods when questions about the limits of authority came to the forefront. From debates over wartime powers to disputes about executive orders, the balance between branches has been repeatedly tested. However, what distinguishes the present situation is the role of rhetoric itself as a focal point of institutional concern. In previous cases, conflicts often centered on concrete policy decisions or legal actions. In contrast, the current crisis revolves around the interpretation and potential consequences of language, highlighting how communication has become a central arena of power. Legal scholars have noted that while the U.S. Constitution strongly protects freedom of speech, it does not eliminate the responsibility of leaders to consider the broader impact of their words. Particularly in a polarized environment, statements perceived as endorsing punitive or extreme measures can be interpreted in ways that extend beyond their original intent. This interpretative gap is where risk emerges. Different groups may receive the same message and derive vastly different meanings, some of which may lead to actions that were never explicitly stated but are implicitly encouraged. This phenomenon has been observed in multiple contexts over recent years, where political language has intersected with real-world events in unpredictable ways. Against this backdrop, Congress has increasingly positioned itself as a counterbalance, emphasizing oversight and accountability. The current response can therefore be seen not only as a reaction to a single statement, but as part of a broader effort to reaffirm institutional boundaries. At the same time, the international dimension adds further complexity. The United States is not operating in isolation, and its internal stability has direct implications for global dynamics. In regions such as the Middle East, where tensions remain high, U.S. leadership plays a critical role in shaping diplomatic and military outcomes. Recent developments involving ceasefire negotiations and shifting alliances have placed additional pressure on decision-makers in Washington. Similarly, the ongoing conflict involving Ukraine continues to demand sustained attention and resources, creating a situation where domestic instability could have ripple effects across multiple fronts. This convergence of internal and external pressures creates a uniquely volatile environment. Decisions made in response to domestic political challenges are now closely intertwined with international strategic considerations. As a result, the stakes are significantly higher than in previous episodes of political controversy. Observers argue that the current moment represents more than a temporary crisis. It reflects a structural shift in how political power is exercised, communicated, and contested in the modern era. In this context, the unfolding events are not merely about one individual or one statement, but about the evolving relationship between leadership, institutions, and society as a whole. The current situation highlights a critical aspect of modern governance: the management of political communication as a component of national stability. In highly polarized environments, statements made by influential figures are no longer isolated expressions, but operational signals that can shape collective behavior across multiple layers of society. From a governance perspective, the response mechanism typically unfolds in several coordinated stages involving legislative oversight, legal assessment, and security monitoring. In this case, Congress has activated its oversight function at an accelerated pace. Multiple committees have initiated reviews aimed at determining whether the statement in question falls within acceptable constitutional boundaries or represents a deviation that requires formal intervention. This process involves detailed textual analysis, contextual interpretation, and comparison with established legal precedents. Legal experts play a central role in this phase, evaluating not only the literal content of the statement but also its potential implications under constitutional principles. Particular attention is given to the concept of incitement, which occupies a legally sensitive space between protected speech and prohibited conduct. Although the threshold for establishing incitement under U.S. law is relatively high, the evaluation process itself carries significant political and institutional weight. At the same time, executive advisors are engaged in parallel efforts to contain the situation. Their role includes reviewing the original statement, preparing clarifications if necessary, and developing communication strategies aimed at stabilizing public perception. This internal response is often conducted under time pressure, as delays can allow narratives to solidify and spread uncontrollably. Meanwhile, federal security agencies are tasked with monitoring potential risks associated with public reaction. This involves tracking online discourse, identifying emerging patterns of radicalization, and assessing whether any groups are mobilizing in response to the statement. The monitoring process extends across both public platforms and restricted communication channels, reflecting the complexity of modern information ecosystems. Security officials are particularly focused on indicators such as coordinated messaging, calls for action, and shifts in tone that may signal escalation. When such indicators are detected, preventive measures are implemented, ranging from increased presence at sensitive locations to coordination with local law enforcement. Another key dimension is crisis communication management. In situations like this, the timing, tone, and consistency of official messaging become critical variables. A carefully calibrated response can reduce tension, while inconsistent or delayed communication may amplify uncertainty and speculation. Political actors must therefore balance multiple objectives: defending their position, maintaining credibility, and preventing further escalation. Within Congress, strategic coordination is equally important. Lawmakers must decide whether to pursue formal actions such as hearings or to rely on political pressure and public statements to achieve their objectives. This decision is influenced by factors including party alignment, public opinion, and the perceived severity of the situation. At the same time, internal party management becomes a crucial component of the overall response. Party leaders must navigate divergent viewpoints within their ranks, ensuring that disagreements do not evolve into visible fractures that could weaken their collective position. This involves continuous consultation, message alignment, and, in some cases, strategic restraint in public communication. From a systems perspective, the interaction between these different layers, legal, legislative, executive, and security, forms a complex response network. Each component operates with its own priorities and constraints, yet all must function in a coordinated manner to prevent systemic instability. The effectiveness of this network depends on both institutional capacity and the willingness of actors to adhere to established norms. When these elements align, the system can absorb shocks and restore equilibrium. However, when coordination breaks down or trust erodes, the risk of escalation increases significantly. In the current case, The rapid convergence of political, legal, and social pressures has created a high-intensity environment. The margin for error has narrowed considerably, and each decision carries immediate and potentially far-reaching consequences. This places the entire system under stress, testing not only procedural mechanisms but also the resilience of institutional relationships. Ultimately, the outcome will depend on how effectively these response mechanisms are executed and whether they succeed in stabilizing the situation before it reaches a critical threshold. As the political tension in Washington intensified, international observers and foreign governments began closely monitoring the situation, recognizing its potential implications beyond U.S. domestic politics. The crisis surrounding Donald Trump's statement did not remain confined within national borders, as it intersected with ongoing geopolitical developments, particularly in the Middle East. At the same time, a separate but deeply connected layer of pressure was building through the evolving conflict involving Israel, Lebanon, and broader regional dynamics. According to multiple reports, the situation in Gaza has reached a level of destruction that is reshaping global perceptions, with casualty figures exceeding tens of thousands and infrastructure damage affecting the vast majority of the territory. These developments have generated increasing concern among international actors, with accusations related to violations of international law becoming more prominent in diplomatic discussions. As images and data continue to circulate globally, pressure has mounted not only on regional players but also on key international stakeholders, including the United States. In parallel, tensions in Lebanon have added another dimension to the crisis. The expansion of military operations into Lebanese territory has raised fears of a broader regional escalation, drawing in additional actors and increasing the complexity of the situation. Within this context, Iran's role has become a focal point of analysis. Rather than engaging in direct, large-scale confrontation, Iran has maintained a strategic position through its influence in the region, allowing it to exert pressure indirectly while avoiding immediate exposure. This approach has created a layered conflict dynamic, where actions on the ground are intertwined with strategic calculations behind the scenes. Against this backdrop, a significant development emerged when Donald Trump announced a 10-day ceasefire initiative between Israel and Lebanon. The announcement was framed as an effort to de-escalate tensions and create space for diplomatic engagement. However, analysts noted that the move also reflected the growing urgency of stabilizing a rapidly deteriorating situation that carried both regional and global consequences. The ceasefire was reportedly activated following a series of high-level communications, with Trump indicating that both sides had agreed to enter a temporary pause in hostilities. At the same time, diplomatic channels intensified, with representatives from Israel and Lebanon engaging in discussions in Washington, marking a rare moment of direct interaction after decades of limited contact. This development signaled a shift in the dynamics of the conflict, suggesting that pressure from multiple directions had reached a point where dialogue became unavoidable. Meanwhile, within the United States, the international dimension of the crisis began to influence domestic political debates. In Congress, discussions emerged regarding military support for Israel, with some lawmakers raising concerns about the scale and implications of continued assistance. Votes and proposals aimed at restricting certain arms transfers highlighted growing divisions, particularly as public opinion became increasingly sensitive to the humanitarian and strategic costs involved. At the same time, economic considerations added further complexity. The scale of financial support and the broader impact on U.S. resources became part of the national conversation, linking foreign policy decisions directly to domestic priorities. Parallel to these developments, the ongoing conflict involving Ukraine continued to exert pressure on the global stage. Recent military actions targeting energy infrastructure have introduced new risks, affecting not only regional stability but also international economic systems connected to energy supply chains. These actions have drawn reactions from multiple countries, including those whose economic interests are directly tied to affected infrastructure. As a result, the geopolitical environment surrounding the United States has become increasingly interconnected, with multiple crises unfolding simultaneously. This convergence has placed Washington in a position where domestic political stability and international strategic management are deeply intertwined. Observers have emphasized that decisions made in response to internal challenges may have immediate consequences on global dynamics, particularly in regions already experiencing high levels of tension. In this context, Donald Trump's role appears to extend beyond domestic politics, positioning him simultaneously as a central figure in both internal controversy and international crisis management. This dual role adds a layer of complexity, as actions taken in one domain inevitably influence outcomes in the other. As diplomatic efforts continue and global actors assess the evolving situation, the central question remains whether these overlapping pressures will lead to stabilization or further escalation. As the situation continues to evolve, analysts have begun outlining several possible scenarios, each carrying different levels of risk and impact for both the United States and the broader international system. The first and most concerning scenario involves further escalation. In this case, continued pressure from Congress, combined with intensifying public reaction, could push the situation into a deeper institutional confrontation. If additional statements or actions amplify existing tensions, the likelihood of formal hearings, legal challenges, or even unprecedented political measures would increase significantly. Such a trajectory could deepen divisions within political parties, making internal fractures more visible and harder to contain. At the same time, heightened public polarization could translate into real-world tensions, particularly if opposing groups mobilize in response to perceived threats or signals. Security experts warn that in environments already under stress, even minor triggers can produce disproportionate reactions. The second scenario represents a controlled stabilization. Under this pathway, political actors on all sides may adopt more measured approaches, seeking to reduce tension through calibrated communication and institutional processes. Clarifications, strategic messaging, and coordinated responses could gradually lower the intensity of the crisis, allowing the system to absorb the shock without entering a full-scale confrontation. Congress might proceed with oversight actions in a structured manner, while avoiding steps that could further inflame the situation. Meanwhile, internal party management could help contain divisions, maintaining a level of cohesion sufficient to prevent systemic disruption. However, even in this scenario, underlying tensions would likely remain unresolved, leaving the system vulnerable to future shocks. The third scenario involves a shift in focus driven by external pressures. As international developments continue to demand attention, particularly in regions such as the Middle East and Eastern Europe, domestic political energy may gradually redirect toward managing global challenges. In this case, the current crisis could lose some immediate intensity, not because it has been resolved, but because it is overshadowed by larger strategic concerns. This shift, however, carries its own risks. Unresolved domestic tensions may persist beneath the surface, potentially resurfacing later with greater force if underlying issues are not addressed. In parallel, the interconnected nature of current global events means that developments in one area can rapidly influence another. For example, instability in U.S. domestic politics could affect diplomatic credibility, which in turn may impact negotiations or conflict management efforts abroad. Similarly, international crises can feed back into domestic debates, reinforcing divisions and shaping political narratives. Another critical factor is time. As the situation unfolds, each passing hour introduces new variables, from public sentiment to institutional responses and international reactions. The speed at which decisions are made or delayed can significantly influence the trajectory of events. Observers often describe such moments as inflection points, where the direction of change is determined by a combination of strategic choices and external pressures. In this environment, even small decisions can carry amplified consequences. A single statement, a policy adjustment, or a shift in tone may alter the balance, either easing tensions or pushing them toward escalation. For Donald Trump, the coming period represents a critical test of political strategy and crisis management. Every move will be scrutinized not only for its immediate impact but also for its longer-term implications within an already volatile system. For Congress, the situation serves as a test of institutional capacity, the ability to respond effectively while maintaining constitutional principles and public trust. And for the broader system, this moment raises fundamental questions about resilience. Can the current political structure withstand the convergence of internal and external pressures without entering a deeper phase of instability? Or is this the beginning of a more profound shift that could reshape the balance of power and the dynamics of governance in the United States? The unfolding situation surrounding Donald Trump has evolved far beyond a single controversial statement, developing into a complex political moment that reflects deeper structural tensions within the United States. What initially appeared to be a sharp rhetorical escalation has triggered a chain reaction involving Congress, legal institutions, security agencies, and public discourse, all converging into a high-pressure environment. At its core, this crisis highlights the fragile balance between political influence, institutional limits, and societal response in an era defined by rapid communication and deep polarization. The reaction from Congress underscores the importance of oversight mechanisms within the American system, demonstrating how legislative bodies respond when perceived boundaries are tested. At the same time, the internal dynamics within political parties reveal another layer of complexity, where unity and division coexist under the pressure of rapidly changing events. Meanwhile, the broader international context adds significant weight to the situation. Ongoing developments in the Middle East and the continued conflict involving Ukraine illustrate how domestic political instability can intersect with global strategic challenges. This convergence amplifies the stakes, making each decision not only a domestic calculation but also a factor in the international arena. As the system continues to respond, the outcome will depend on a combination of institutional resilience, political strategy, and the ability to manage public perception under pressure. Moments like this often serve as defining points, where the direction of future developments is shaped by how effectively challenges are addressed in real time. For Donald Trump, the coming period represents a critical juncture where every action carries both immediate consequences and long-term implications. For Congress, it is a test of its capacity to enforce accountability while maintaining stability. And for the United States as a whole, it is a moment that may influence not only current dynamics but also the broader trajectory of its political system. The key question now remains unresolved. Will this crisis gradually stabilize through institutional processes, or will it escalate into a deeper confrontation with lasting consequences? And more importantly, what does this moment reveal about the future balance of power in the United States? We will continue to follow these developments closely and provide in-depth analysis as the situation unfolds. If you found this breakdown useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest global analysis. And most importantly, we want to hear your perspective. Do you believe this situation will de-escalate, or is it the beginning of a larger political shift?